As I said, my background is in philosophy, and particularly philosophy of mind and Zen Buddhism. So what led me to John Moriarty then, or to my interest in him, is that I just met someone just over a year ago. So it's just a full year now that I've been researching his work, who made me aware of his writings. So my PhD thesis that I got in 2015 was about the tendency in Western philosophy to create categories that cause us to kind of treat parts of the world as separate from each other, right? So in Cartesian dualism, that's trying to figure out what the separation or the connection between mind and matter is. This kind of creates the impression that the things that we call mind and the things that we call matter are somehow intrinsically separate from each other. And then my argument was that this sense of separation kind of feeds back into our behavior. And with relevance to the talk tonight, it's the idea that when we think of humans as kind of separate from their environment, or humans can treat themselves as separate from their environment. And this leads to a lot of environmental impacts, mainly negative. And I was contrasting that with the interconnectedness or the principles of interdependence that you find in Buddhism, and in particular within Zen Buddhism. So as soon as I started reading Moriarty, I was picking up on some of those themes that were coming through in his work. But I think what's so fascinating about him is that he was, apart from a few years of his life, he was never a professional academic. He wouldn't, he wasn't a professor. He wasn't, he was a philosopher purely by vocation. Rather than by qualification, you could say. So yeah, for full disclosure, basically I've been reading him for a year. I still haven't got through his full bibliography because it's really substantial and quite dense. So Night Journey to Buddh Gaya is the book I'm waiting to read to finish his bibliography. I've been reading a lot of background material and talking to people who knew him personally as well. So it's very valuable that we still have people who personally knew him, so we can get a feeling on how his character influenced the philosophy that he ended up writing and talking about. So just to run through, basically what I'm going to present tonight is just a little bit of a biography of the man himself. I know some of you will be aware of John Moriarty and his work already, but I'm kind of going to go on the basis that that we haven't heard from him, that we're not too familiar with his work. So a little bit of his biography of the kind of major events of his life. And then I'm going to break down about 3 or 4 quotes from his writings that seem maybe a little abstract or a little difficult to follow. And I'm going to put them in the context of the environmentalism and ecological concerns that come through in his writing, and see if we can unpack them. So I'll give you another bit of bad news. I'm going to give you some homework. So there's something I'd like us to consider as we go through the talk here, if that's okay, and maybe we can get to this in the discussion. So as you're listening to what I'm presenting here tonight, there's 2 questions I'd like you to consider. So the first is, in what way do we shape the earth to suit ourselves? So Moriarty is making the claim that we shape the earth to suit ourselves. So I'd like us to kind of figure out together how it is that we actually do that. And secondly, in what tangible or practical ways, in an everyday sense, are we disconnected from the earth? And by the earth, I don't mean the globe, the planet necessarily in the big view. I mean just, the earth, the soil, outside our doors. How are we disconnected from that and our ecology? So there's just last remarks just on the introduction to Moriarty's work. There's just so many themes and such a rich, literary references and his own poetry and other people's poetry, philosophy of mind, comparative philosophy. There's so many different world religions that he draws upon. And at best tonight, we're just going to manage, a very brief primer on his environmental concerns. So I'm going to try and keep the focus to that, even though there's so much more we could say about his work. So to talk a little bit about him biographically, Moriarty was born on the 2nd of February in Moyvan, County Kerry, 1938, and he's born into a farming family. Then in 1943 to 1951, he attends the National School in Moyvan. From 1951 to 1956, he attends St. Michael's College in Listowel. This is relevant to our story later because this is where he obtains a copy of Darwin's The Origin of Species, which has a profound effect on his later thought. Between 1959 and 1962, he spends time in University College Dublin, and he graduates with a first-class honours in philosophy and logic. That is, to the best of my knowledge, the last official academic, the first and last academic honours that he receives. And it was the days before academic inflation, when an undergraduate degree was enough to get you teaching jobs, which he does in the University of Manitoba in Canada. And he teaches there from 1965 until 1971. Then in 1971, he quits his position in Canada and he returns to Ireland, and he lives in various locations, working mainly as a gardener in places such as Inishbofin, Ballyconneely and Toombeola. He then goes back to England for a year between 1976 and 77. We won't have time to get into this tonight, but there's an interesting interview from RT Radio from, I think, the 1990s that you can find pretty easily online, where he explains this year that he spends in a Carmelite priory in Boars Hill in Oxford, and he's basically the gardener by day and living the Carmelite tradition by the rest of the day. And that really suited his character and his temperament. But eventually he does return to Ireland after roughly a year, between 1978 and 1995. Again, he's in various locations around Ireland. He works as a gardener. He starts kind of writing extensively, and he gives occasional talks which become more frequent, and he gives more media appearances. But it's not until 1994, so he's into his 50s, before he publishes his first book, Dreamtime. It's probably his best known work, and it's the work that a lot of people find to be the first text of his that they get into. Sometimes they read it and they never read another word of his because it's so dense and so complex in many ways, but hopefully we'll find a remedy for that tonight. Then between 1995 and 2007, Moriarty is living in the beautiful setting of Mangerton in Killarney. He's writing, again, more extensively, publishes the rest of his books, and he passes away there on the 1st of June 2007. The backdrop to my slides tonight are the view from his grave, which I, just the day before the second lockdown happened a few weeks ago, I was out in Killarney and I visited his grave for the first time. And so that's the view he's got, looking out over the lakes of Killarney there. Okay. So his bibliography, very extensive, very dense. I'm just reading Nostos at the moment, which is his autobiography, and that's just under 700 pages, and that's just the first volume of his autobiography. And so with the exception of Serious Sounds on this list, most of his books are, extremely long, dense, complicated, but again, hopefully we can cut through some of the complications and the abstractions tonight and get to what I believe are some of the very relevant and direct messages that his work have. Okay, so there's the man himself, looking suitably serious and philosophical. But he was a lot of fun, I'm led to believe as well. But you have to look serious for the headshots, don't you? So I'm just going to give a bit more of the story of John's early life as it relates to the kind of philosophical concerns that he has later on, in particular environment, religion, and a theme that's going to come up a lot tonight, which is how story, narrative, and worldview shapes the way we live and shapes the way we behave. He's born into a Catholic farming family in rural Kerry. And this is important because obviously it sets the scene for his life. But it's also important for tonight's topic that he's in nature from a very early age, and he's immersed in nature from a very early age. It's not an urban environment that he's growing up in. It's very much rural Ireland of the early 20th century. And he's raised inside the traditional biblical story, and he describes this himself as the world in 5 acts. So this is creation, fall, revelation, redemption, and last things. And then as a young man, he receives and reads a copy of Darwin's The Origin of Species. And this story, this book, shakes him out of his worldview completely. So he goes from believing in the world as 4,000 plus years old to millions of years old. And this has a profound effect on him in many ways. And one of the recurrent themes in his work, one of the ones that is very dominant, is the idea that stories and worldviews and beliefs really have the power to shape us and our behaviors. So in his late teens and 20s, he works and trains in academia, and specifically in philosophy and literature. But then he abandons that life and returns to settle in Ireland, and he wants to rediscover what he calls his bush soul. And again, that's almost indigenous terminology. And again, he draws on so many indigenous creation myths and indigenous stories. First peoples of the world, their stories are very important to him. So what exactly did this mean? What does this rediscovering his bush soul mean? Returning to primal nature. So there's a few stories that illustrate this. When he tells of walking in the hills and disturbing a hare, which flees from him. So he frightens this hare, it runs off, and then he sees the indent of the hare's shape left in the grass, and he kneels down and places his head inside the shape of the indent in the grass, and he asks it to act as a poultice, sucking European culture and conditioning out of his head. So this is the extent to which he really wants to kind of be deconditioned or unconditioned from the life that he had been born into and that he had been raised within. In a further episode, he douses himself 3 times in a river in an act that he describes as baptizing himself out of religion and culture. There's a brilliant analogy that he gives in a very short television clip that can be found in the RT archives, where he shows the presenter a rhododendron flower that he's replanting. So he's put it inside a pot, and he wants to plant it in a few months so that it can grow wild again. But he talks about how when you place a plant inside a pot, the roots eventually will grow against the side of the pot and start turning back into the soil. So the roots are trying to grow, but as soon as they hit the limits of where they're contained, they start to turn back in on themselves, and they're growing through exhausted soil that can't really have any more richness. And that's what he says he felt like growing up inside Western and European culture, that he was culture bound, as he calls it. So, he could only live inside this culture for so long before he felt that it was exhausting him and kind of impoverishing his life. And this is why he wants to go back to this kind of primal nature that he tries to experience in Ireland. And it's another theme of his life and of his work, that on the one hand, he's been, for someone who grew up in rural Ireland at this time, he's gotten a great education and he's made something of himself through education. But he also knows that there is certain skepticism or distrust of the education system that you need to have if you want to have a proper balance between kind of living a civilized life, but also living a kind of a life that's true to the wild nature that he believes exists and that is important for all of us. So he wants to build his mind back up to remake himself by kind of having these pure, how would we call, very vibrant experiences of nature, of color, things like color and shape, things as basic as that. So he documents, for example, sitting 8 hours by a waterfall, and he spends 4 hours with his eyes closed, just listening to the water. And it's not just the nice sound of the waterfall that he wants to hear, it's listening itself. He wants to get to the bottom of what listening is. Then he spends a further 4 hours just watching the waterfall. So again, he doesn't just want to see how pretty the water is, he wants to see what seeing is. He wants to get right down to the bottom of sensation. And this is quite common in philosophical traditions all over the world for, as long as there's been philosophy, there's this idea that you start from some kind of first principle or some kind of base and you build from there. But in this case, he's doing it for the second time, but this time he's doing it outside of an education system, kind of independently. So Moriarty repeatedly returns to the idea that we are increasingly and regrettably disconnected from nature. And this is a fact that not only harms our ecosystem by treating it as something external to ourselves, but it also harms us emotionally and psychologically because we fail to heed the interconnectedness with our environment and indeed with each other. And again, maybe for the questions, if we get a chance to talk about this during the discussion, could we think about what ways, just on a practical everyday basis, that we are disconnected from nature, or that we treat ourselves as disconnected from nature? And if you wanted confirmation as to how important he thought the concept of interconnectedness is, then you can look at this picture on the left. So I took this when I visited his graveyard a few weeks ago in Aherne Heights in Killarney. And in the center there, you'll see a phrase which I'm sure I'm going to mispronounce, but it's Mitakuye Oyasin. This is a phrase from the Lakota tribe, and it can be translated as "we are all related." And it invokes the interconnectedness of all things as the Lakota saw it, and certainly as John Moriarty himself saw it. And you'll also see a phrase that he repeatedly used throughout his life, and that still resonates today, that he was trying to learn how to stand beautifully on the earth. You'll see that at the bottom of his headstone there. So, what I'm going to do next is just unpack a few of his quotes from his writing. So we'll just read through these. We'll have a chance to listen to the man himself talk as well. And we'll try and get to the bottom. Or in the case of Moriarty's work, often you're just scratching the surface by just trying to find out what the message within his writing. So we'll start with this. This is from the introduction of his autobiography, Nostos. Even when, with the help of myth, we come to see and accept who we are, we can still mismanage who we are. Culturally, we can get off to a bad start, as I believe we in the West did. Given the ecological havoc inside and outside ourselves, it behooves us, claiming to be sapient, to do something about it. So there's a lot of foundational things about Moriarty's work in this quote. The focus on myth as something that can both inform and mislead us. The worry of what culture does to us. So as much as we can become civilized through culture, we can also lose the important wildness of our nature through culture. Ecological havoc, we can describe Moriarty as a philosopher, but he's certainly not a head in the clouds philosopher. He is deeply concerned with the damage that we're doing to the planet and the damage we're doing to ourselves. And that's another theme that comes up through his work that was in the description of this talk as well, which is that you can't just worry about how the outside world is, or you can't just worry about how your inner world is. The two are intimately connected, again, interconnected. And as he said, he believes that we should do something about that, right? We shouldn't be sitting on our hands. And I should say this is a man who passed away in 2007, so I can only imagine the kind of opinions or input he would have if he was existing or if he still was alive today. And you could see the kind of in some cases the optimism, but in other cases the exacerbation of some of the climate crises. One of the things that Moriarty believes about Greek myth in particular is that in its favor, he says it names the beast in us and it forces us to confront our beastly nature. And one of the prime references to this is, of course, Theseus and the Minotaur. So the Minotaur is kind of presented as something to be defeated, this very dark underworld, frightening, almost malignant presence. But the darkness or the threat of the Minotaur is the same threat that's within ourselves. And he comes back to this idea of integration over suppression. So often we're suppressing our darker urges, and we think that by suppressing them, we're making ourselves more civilized or more cultured. But in fact, we need to integrate those things into our world. We need to integrate the idea of wildness or the idea of a bit of a dark nature. And I should say at this point, we've mentioned environment and nature and ecology so much already, but he doesn't believe that nature is all, sweetness and light. He does acknowledge the violence and the brutality of nature. But the thing to be careful with is that by trying to strip away or suppress the brutality of nature by making ourselves more civilized and more cultured, we're in fact denying confrontation with things that are essentially a part of us, the wildness within us. And we'll talk about that a little more momentarily. He also talks about the Promethean myths. So Prometheus steals fire from the gods so that we can become more civilized and we can, as he says, shape the earth to suit ourselves. But as we'll see with some examples later on, using technology to try and make the world more civilized often ends up making it more chaotic and more dangerous. So that's myth, and that's what myth can do to us. But it's not just the story of myth that can shape our beliefs and behaviors. It's also the story of more later arrivals on the philosophical scene. So he's critical of things like rationality, or he's critical of the idea, for example, of using mathematics or what gets referred to as logical positivism, you know, the idea that you can kind of break the world into number or measure and figure everything out from there. He's very skeptical about this. As much as it helps us, again, be civilized and be cultured, these things still shape our beliefs and shape our behaviors, and not always to the positive. And again, we'll look at some practical examples of that later on before we wrap up. So the last thing we'll say about myth for the moment, and his impression of myth and what he thinks it means for human life and behavior and connection with environment, is this. So Theseus, again, remember Theseus is kind of, you know, if we are taught these myths in schools, Theseus is generally presented as a hero who slays this dark beast and, you know, kind of saves the day. So Moriarty, again, as a young man, says, Theseus either killed or slaughtered everything anarchaic that came his way. In this, he was making the earth safe for civilization and culture. But no matter how long I reflected on it, I couldn't convince myself that this was the best way to go about things. Down the road from this was psychic topiary. So we'll come to what exactly he means by psychic topiary in a moment. And it's a feature of his writing that he'll drop a phrase in like that, and he might take, you know, 10 or 20 pages to get to the explanation of it, but we'll see what he means by that. But again, the important thing I think to take away from this is that, you know, the slaying of the dark part of our nature, it isn't always good, because maybe the dark or the wild or the more primal part of our nature is something that we need to integrate rather than something that we need to suppress. So we'll get to listen to the man himself talk here, and Jerry, maybe you can put your hand up or just interrupt if we're not hearing this, but it should be coming through okay. So I've just transcribed this from a radio interview. It's not available online, but if anyone would like a copy, you can contact me to get a copy of it. So I've transcribed it so you can just read along, but it's nice to hear the man himself talk. So we listen to what he has to say about wildness and what he has to say about the way we engineer the world and what it can do to our minds and to our environment.
I remember one day going out, you know, walking by the canal, you know, and the Lord save us, like, it's the Grand Canal, and Lord save us, like, that paddy canal, a cavernous all over it, and that I didn't love at all, because, like, it was so engineered, and it didn't sound like any of the rivers that I knew, you know. And I would almost plead with God, you know, instead of me being a canal, an engineered canal, engineered by culture, like, you know, let me be a wild river. And then I went out one day to Monkstown, out around Monkstown, just looking around our city, you know, and what it was like in the outskirts. And there was one place where I saw all these trees that have been subjected to topiary, and I say topiary, not topiary, like, you know, they were turned into cubes and turned into pyramids and turned into squares and turned into spheres and all kinds of things, like, and thought, what a terrible thing to have done to subject all these bushes to such Euclidean shapes, like, you know. Mm-hmm. And I said, like, you know, please God, if you can't accept me as a wild river, then I'm lost. And if you can't accept me as a wild bush, you know, not turned into a cube or into a Euclidean shape, then I'm lost, like, you know. But you have to accept me, God, as a wild river, and you have to accept me as a kind of wild bush, like the like of which I'd see grown below in Kerry somewhere, you know, side of the bog road, you know. And that was my plea to God, like, me the wild river, me the wild bush, like.
Okay, so again, within this quote, as you noticed, I had to edit out the Genoes, because Geno is probably the phrase he repeats the most when you hear him interviewed. But within this interview and within this extract from the interview, there's so much of what concerned the man himself, both in his personal life and in his writing. Again, as I say, you know, he's described often as a philosopher, but he was very intimately connected with the content of what he wrote. It wasn't kind of a day job that he switched off from at night. It seems these things really took up his mind day and night. So in this, he talks about wildness, the importance of wildness, and that he doesn't want to be himself treated as something kind of shaped by his culture, or even shaped physically by the land around him. And for a proud Corkman such as myself, his autobiography has a great critique of why Dublin is not a nice city to walk around, which he eventually comes around to. You know, he gives Dublin a break in the end, but he does talk about how it's so engineered. The rivers are engineered, the trees are turned into Euclidean shapes. And again, this is congruous with his idea that just in the way we literally shape the earth, we shape, if you go to a planted forest, for example, it's nice that there's a forest there, but you're often looking at unnaturally lined planted trees, or we have this topiary, as he pronounces it, where we shape landscapes. We have geoengineering, where we shape land itself. And he's worried that not only are we doing this destructive act to nature, but that it's kind of parallel to what we do to ourselves when we allow ourselves to be completely shaped by the culture that we exist within. And again, maybe this is something you can reflect on yourself personally, in that, how is it that your sociological self, or your day-to-day self, is perhaps disconnected from something wilder or something more primal? And I don't think that's a judgmental thing on his part. I really think it's just a worry that it's something that we maybe could think about more often to our benefit. We also have the religious struggle that Moriarty goes through. He's talking about, he loses his Christian faith at some point during his life, and later on he finds it again in an interview. He mentions that when he became a Christian again, it wasn't for the second time, it was for the first time, and it wasn't born again or anything like that. He just had what seemed to be a kind of mystic or religious revelation later in life. But you can see even very early on, this is as a young man in university in Dublin, that he's worried about his relationship with what he calls God, and that he won't be accepted as the wild thing that he is. That he's worried about being overly shaped or kind of tamed by his culture. So, technology permitting, we'll be able to see him talking there now. And again, Jerry, you might jump in if there's anything not working here, but this is about 1.5 minutes of an interview with the comedian Tommy Tiernan, who was doing a walk around Ireland and who stopped off to talk to Moriarty. And this is a very explicit message about wildness, and he talks a little more technically about what he means by shaping the earth to suit ourselves. So I'll just take a moment to set this up, and we'll listen to him.
We shape the earth to suit us. We plough it and we knock it and we shape it and we reshape it. Dolphins were land animals once, and they went down into the sea. They said to the ocean, as it were, shape me to suit you. And now the Lord save us. I was in a house in Connemara there sometime recently, and I saw a dolphin bone. The curve of it was as beautiful as any couple of bars of Mozart's music. It was so beautiful. Like, I've no bone in my body that is shaped to the earth like that. Like, so they said, shape us to suit you. We went the opposite way. We shaped the earth to suit us. That's going to fail. I'm just saying that shaping and reshaping, if we turn the whole earth into a Holland, we're gone. Because, like, unless there's wildness around you, something terrible happens to the wildness inside of you. And if the wildness inside of you dies, like, I think you're finished. There's a good wildness. I'm not talking about wickedness now. I'm talking about, in Connemara, like they say, squeal amachai and be a siri, like, wilderness outside and wilderness inside. Wildness outside and a bit of wildness inside, like. But not wild in the sense that there's a wildness in which you don't need to break laws. Like, you don't need to you don't need to be an anarchist, But it's just that you're not dominated and overwhelmed by who you sociologically are.
Okay, so again, I mean, he gives that interview much later in life, but you can see just by listening to him there, the same concerns were kind of haunting him. This idea, he says right at the end, that you're not tamed or controlled by who you sociologically are. So obviously we all exist on the day-to-day. We interact with each other as regular people in our roles, or as friends, or as family members. But again, going back to that idea that's a lot of that is influenced by the story that you're brought up within, and it could be a political story or a religious story, but that shapes your impression of who you are, and then that shapes how you interact with others and how you behave. And perhaps how you view the planet. So that's on the individual level, but now I want to introduce a few examples
I remember one.
Of more global concern, we'll say. And we'll do so by having a look at this phrase that he uses. This is from a book called Horsehead Nebula Neighing, which is part of a trilogy that he wrote called Turtle Was Gone a Long Time. And that's a reference to a creation myth that he explains within the books. So a lot of his writing, again, and in particular the Turtle trilogy, is reliant on the idea of how the beginning of stories, whether they be personal stories or universal stories, kind of shape the way we behave and the way we perceive the world. So he says, nothing so damages the universe and our relationship to it as the image of it as something made, as handiwork. So if you look at a religious tradition close to home, you can think of the book of Genesis here. That's a creation story, and remember that he says he was very explicitly conscious of the fact that he was brought up inside the 5 acts story of creation from the Bible, and creation itself being the first act, as written in the book of Genesis. And obviously the text of the book of Genesis suggests that the world was made for people. Not just was the world made for people kind of to do with what they will, but it was made. So he has this concern that if you think of the world as something made, as handiwork, as he calls it, then you're more likely to kind of treat it as something that you can to knock or engineer or shape to your own concerns. Now, at one point in one of his books, Moriarty claims that we're not a species that has gained what he calls evolutionary legitimacy. And one of the ways we can see this is the fact that we treat our planet and its resources like a commodity. We shape the earth to suit ourselves, while almost every other creature is shaped to suit the earth. And one of the issues that he has with this concept of civilization, so he said that Theseus killed the Minotaur, slayed the beast and made the world safer for civilization and culture. But the wildness and the admittedly the violence that exists in nature, I guess you could say that he worries about the kind of covert violence that happens within culture. So we allow terrible things to happen to each other. We allow poverty, we allow inequality, we allow racism, discrimination, ecological havoc, and all of that's happening under the guise of civilization. But you think if you lived inside a true civilization, these things wouldn't exist. So he's worried that, again, the suppression of wildness or the suppression of things that are primal instincts actually can do more harm than good. So I'm going to give a couple of global examples before I come back around and wrap up with some local examples. The image you should be seeing now up on your left there is taken a few days after the Chernobyl disaster in 1986, the world's worst nuclear catastrophe. Now I'm going to go back and quote from a book called Midnight in Chernobyl by the British journalist Adam Higginbotham. This book deals with the lead up in the decades before the Chernobyl disaster and the cleanup operation after Chernobyl. And bearing in mind the title of this talk, Shaping the Earth to Suit Ourselves, I'll read this section about a man called Anatoly Alexandrov, who became the leader of Soviet nuclear science in the mid-20th century. Alexandrov oversaw the design of reactors for nuclear submarines and icebreakers, as well as the prototypes of the new channel graphite reactors designed to generate electricity. To reduce the cost of building these, he emphasized economies of scale and insisted on increasing their size to colossal proportions using standardized components and common factory materials. He saw no reason that manufacturing nuclear reactors should be any different from making tanks or combine harvesters. Alexandrov regarded the serial production of these massive reactors as the key to Soviet economic development, and atomic power as the means to realize Ozymandian dreams of irrigating deserts, bringing tropical oases to the Arctic North, and leveling inconveniently situated mountains with atom bombs, or, as the Russian expression went, correcting the mistakes of nature. So I think, as those of you who followed David Attenborough know, and he's talking about the Anthropocentrian, right? So we're kind of going through this brief but significant period where anthropocentrism is ruling, you know, the world is for people, I think it bears just repeating the last sentence of this extract. Alexandrov, the head of Soviet nuclear science, wanted to irrigate deserts, bring tropical oases to the Arctic North, and level inconveniently situated mountains with atom bombs, correcting the mistakes of nature. So if there's not a more explicit idea of shaping the earth to suit ourselves, I don't know what is. Here's one from the news lately. This is an ongoing argument. I don't think this has been settled yet. If you look in the bottom left of this image, you'll see the subtitle, "There are more than 1,000 mink farms in Denmark." So we won't get into this in detail, but I want to draw a disturbing circularity here, okay? So we increasingly encroach on wildlife, and one of the potential consequences of that is that we release viruses into the human population. This virus then originates in China, travels across Europe. One of the countries it hits is Denmark, where mink are grown on mink farms to create fur that gets turned into clothing, which then gets sold back to China. And this virus has mutated such that mink can both contract it and pass it on. And as a result, we've got 17 million of these animals that will be destroyed. Yeah, so seems quite insane, but it's one of the things we do. And it's, you know, as with Chernobyl, it's something that actually happened and actually is happening. Now, everyone's heard of Chernobyl. I wonder how many of you have heard of Kishtim. And again, the idea of covert violence against nature that's in Moriarty's writing is quite prescient in this story. Kishtim is a very remote part of Russia, and I'll just read a brief extract here. In the late afternoon of 29th of September 1957, residents of the Chelyabinsk district in southern Urals noticed unusual bluish-violet colors in the sky. The regional press speculated about polar lights appearing exceptionally far south. However, within a few days, a slew of government activity became evident around the military area that housed the nuclear facility, Mayak. Peasants were required to slaughter their livestock, bury their crops, and plough their farmland. More than 20 villages comprising over 11,000 people were evacuated and completely demolished. Now, the Mayak incident didn't have the same global impact and scope as Chernobyl, but that whole area, or chunks of that area, were irradiated and are uninhabitable to this day. Can't drink the water, can't grow crops, can't graze wildlife, and it's not safe for people to live there. So that's, again, as a species, in the interests of creating atomic power, that's one of the consequences that we have to deal with. A closer to home example, this is the Bandon River. I don't know if we have any Bandon residents here, but there's ongoing trouble there. So again, I won't go into this in too much detail, but it's just a visualization of that idea that, you know, humans need to inhabit the environment just like any other animal needs to inhabit a section of the environment. But once that habitation starts flooding, then what happens is, rather than kind of trying to adapt in perhaps a more organic way, because we settle the way we do, you know, we settle with houses made of firm foundations. We can't just pick them up and move them. We end up dredging rivers, redirecting them, damming them up. There's a double irony here, of course, that we do that to the rivers because they're flooding, but we're not exactly sure, are they flooding because that's what happens naturally, or if that's as a result of the kind of climate impact that we as a species are wont to kind of to have on our local and global environment. One last local example, again, anyone who's familiar with this tree in Ballyvorney, I want to talk about what Moriarty might have thought about this, or what relevance his work would have had to this particular example. So I won't go through the article in detail, but basically this tree was planted in 1900 in the schoolyard. So if you've ever passed through Ballyvorney, you will have passed this tree, assuming you've passed there in the last 120 years. It was planted by school students very deliberately as a kind of a nature project. Then what happens, and we'll, again, in the context of Moriarty's work, you could say the tree planting itself wasn't necessarily natural because people did it, right? It was an intentional human action. But one of the things that pops up throughout Moriarty's work with regard to our environment is that issue of preservation. So things like trees and rivers, they preserve life in the sense that they are ecosystems for fish and insect life and bird life and, you know, all sorts of flora and fauna. But they also preserve mental health, right? So I think it's non-controversial to say that in general, you know, exposure to nature, to the natural environment is healthy for us because it's what we came from. But they also preserve heritage. This tree, you can go through this article, I'll leave a link in the slides afterwards. This tree saw a lot of history pass through. It was a dominant part of the local environment in a very historical area. There's a lot to do with civil wars and such in around Ballyvorney, and this tree kind of grew up through all of that. You know, it's in the background of photographs. It's in the school children who went there, you know, were passing it every day, and they knew that it was part of their heritage because it was one of their ancestors that had planted it. But then again, coming back to this phrase, shaping the earth to suit ourselves. As the town grew up, people want nicely tarmacked roads, so the footpath was tarmacked. Tarmac stops water leaching out of trees as it naturally would in grassland or in soil. The limbs of the tree became extremely heavy to the point where there was a concern that they might fall off and injure or worse kill someone. And what was the solution? Well, the solution was to take, you know, a chainsaw to the tree and chop it up to what you see in the picture there. So again, it was everything about this story was a human-caused problem, and suggests that we were acting just out of balance and probably out of losing a sense of care to a natural phenomenon. So that's just a local space. So a local example. I'm going to leave you with this last quote, and I'm going to make my concluding remarks. I'm hoping everything came through here tonight and that you had a chance to reflect on some of the themes that came up, and that hopefully we'll have a little while for discussion afterwards. I'll leave you with this conclusion. Again, from Horsehead Nebula neighing, Moriarty claims the Earth is the planet in space we should be journeying towards. So progress, as we normally understand the term, comes at a potential psychological and environmental cost. The nuclear power that could help us transition from reliance on fossil fuels can, if mismanaged, poison whole chunks of the Earth. The lights which keep our towns and cities operational after dark are the same lights that blind us to the night sky as our ancestors would have seen it for eons. The rationality that helps us live a more civilized life is often the same rationality that dismisses the folklore of first peoples that contains valuable lessons on how, as Moriarty would say, to stand beautifully on the earth. What is certain in Moriarty's writing is that he was driven by contrast and contradiction. He argued for the sanctity of inclusion and integration over exclusion and repression. He noted that the journey inwards into the depths of our psyche was as important and as relevant as the journey outwards into physical space. It's tempting for some to look beyond the salvation of this planet and wonder if the human story will be forced to continue on another. Moriarty considered the physical exploration of space to be relatively trivial if not matched by an equally committed exploration of inner space, the no man fathomed depths of Hopkins that he so regularly quotes. If we don't explore and alter our inner landscapes, we leave ourselves open to the terrible exploitation and destruction of our outer landscapes. It's easy to stand on this earth and miss the richness of what's right in front of you. To see, as Moriarty describes, cows as pounds of meat and trees as kilos of timber. We should make a concerted effort to stop shaping the earth to suit ourselves, and in doing so we may understand what he means when he says that the earth is the planet in space we should be journeying towards. Thanks for listening, everyone.